Hello, and welcome to Press TV News Analysis. I'm Kaveh Tafwai. Democrats push for raising the debt limit, rejected by the Republican-controlled House. Their message, they will not accept an increase in U.S.'s debt limit without substantial spending cuts. But how can there be spending cuts when there's a spending spree? The U.S. is involved militarily in 4, possibly 5 wars, as one example. And domestically, well, you have the Treasury and the Health and Human Services. There, the U.S. government is taking taxes and spending it elsewhere. U.S.'s spending and debt, that's the subject of this edition of Press TV News Analysis.
The U.S. House has overwhelmingly rejected President Barack Obama's call for an increase of the $14.3 trillion debt ceiling. Even some Democrats voted against the bill. Although symbolic, the vote is a clear message that Republicans are not going to backtrack from their demands for deep spending cuts. House Leader John Boehner has released a statement signed by more than 150 economists which back his calls for spending cuts.
It's unfortunately that we are facing months of uncertainty until August, until both parties quit playing games to appeal to their grandstands.
Tuesday's vote came roughly 2 months before a Treasury Department's deadline to increase the ceiling. The Treasury has been tapping alternate funding sources since the debt limit was reached in mid-May. It has warned that it will run out of options if Congress doesn't act by August 2nd. Democrats have so far insisted that they will not consider cuts until Republicans consider tax increases. Last week, Vice President Joe Biden and senior lawmakers began talks to avert a potentially catastrophic debt default. They focused on Medicare and Medicaid programs that represent nearly a quarter of all federal spending. The U.S. has been grappling with an economic downturn since it unleashed wars on Afghanistan and Iraq since the Bush presidency. The U.S.'s rampant spending and continual financing of wars have multiplied the debt default. Expanding military bases in the Middle East and opening yet other fronts in Pakistan and Libya are likely to worsen America's debt scenario.
And the fact that there are lots of Americans who realize that more than $14 trillion of debt is totally irresponsible and a great danger to future generations of Americans.
The hard-pressed American taxpayers have already begun voicing concerns about the state of the economy. In April, tens of thousands of Americans rallied against the proposed budget cuts. Protesters in Wisconsin occupied the state's capital for several weeks against measures to reduce employees' pay. The showdown over the debt ceiling is likely to continue well into the summer, with consequences for the economy and Wall Street. Finding common ground will be difficult, as political wrangling ahead of the 2012 presidential election is complicating the situation. Experts argue that failure to increase the debt limit could be devastating for the U.S. and other economies around the world.
Well, let's try to find out if we can get some answers to some of those questions regarding U.S.'s debt and other related factors. Our guests include former Assistant Secretary to the U.S. Treasury, Paul Craig Roberts, who joins us from Atlanta, Georgia. Also, we have financial journalist Max Keiser, who joins us from Paris. And from the Western Regional Coordinator of the Answer Coalition, Richard Becker, joins us from San Francisco. Thank you all for joining us in this Press TV News Analysis. I would like to start with Paul Craig Roberts. Paul Craig Roberts, the Democrats are pushing for raising the debt ceiling while the GOP is looking for the budget cuts. Tell us, first of all, basically, what is the difference there? I mean, some economists are saying that that's like the two edges of the sword.
Well, what the issue is, in my opinion, the Republicans are trying to use the budget deficit to cut the social programs such as Social Security and Medicare. They want to privatize Social Security, and they want to end the Medicare program. They regard these programs.
Okay, it looks like we may have lost Paul Craig Roberts there. Max Keiser, let me come to you.
As a form of welfare. And so they're using the... Here. Hello?
Yes, do you have my voice, Paul Craig Roberts?
Yes, I do. I hear you. Yes.
Okay. Well, let me move on to Max Keiser. We can come back to your comments on that. Max Keiser, first of all, why don't you tell us the difference between deficit and debt? First of all, in terms of that definition, accounting-wise, it seems like the U.S., if that definition is correct, is bankrupt, since all they're doing is paying interest without having any money to spend. Is that correct?
Yes, well, what we're witnessing is the United States effectively committing financial suicide. You'd have to compare it to maybe a death cult like Jim Jones in Guyana, who convinced the entire population of the cult to drink the cyanide-laced Kool-Aid and to kill themselves. This is the proposition that both the Republicans and the Democrats have on offer. They simply want to continue to invade countries, blow through trillions of dollars that they don't have, while simultaneously gutting all of the manufacturing capacity of the country and destroying the food supply with chemicals and genetically modified products, guaranteeing that most of the Americans today will come down with cancer in the next 5 to 10 years from GMO foods, cell phones, and everything else that America excels at.
Well, let me. Since you talked about the wars, I'd like to get your idea, Richard Becker. You have 4 wars, maybe 5. We're looking at. Let's look at Afghanistan. $1.5 trillion yearly to maintain it. Of course, 411 bases there. You have the wars in Iraq, Libya. They just extended that until the end of September, with possible additions, increased involvement. I mean, how is it that the U.S. can maintain these huge costs and the effect that it's having, and of course, regarding the debt that they keep accumulating?
Well, of course they can't. And that's what is bankrupting the country, is militarism. And, you know, if we just take the war in Afghanistan by itself, the Department of Defense officially spends around $310 million per day just on Afghanistan. If you take into account the real cost of militarism this year, now next year, in next year's budget, the figure for Department of Defense is about $741 billion. But that leaves out the interest payment on debt from previous wars, which adds up to about another $300 billion, according to the Congressional Budget Office. It leaves out veterans benefits, the cost of the CIA, the National Security Agency. So when you really put together the budget for the security services, the military and military-related, it really comes to about $1.37 trillion. And a trillion, of course, is $1 million. We're talking about immense amounts of money. And since World War II, in current dollars, the United States has spent somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 times what is the current national debt of $14 trillion.
Okay, that gives us a good idea. Richard Becker, I'm sorry to jump in. How do you explain then legislation that's being passed that gives a blank check for the U.S. to basically go and have endless wars whenever they want to, wage a war anywhere in the world?
Well, here we have the Congress, and with very, very few exceptions, the congressional leaders and members of Congress will vote for these budgets year after year after year. And they're not only funding those wars. Why are there U.S. military bases all over Japan, 66 years after the end of World War II? All over Germany. What are they doing there? Why are there 740 U.S. military bases official and up to 300 secret bases in more than 100 countries around the world? And this is what is really a fundamental root cause of the financial crisis today. But neither the Republicans nor the Democrats will talk about militarism as this fundamental cause of the financial and economic crisis that the United States is in.
And why is that, Paul Craig Roberts? I mean, these are huge amounts. One of the many examples that I'm going to bring into the picture, the war spending, which obviously adds to the debt. And we don't even know if the debt is really $14 trillion. If some accounts say 60, and some accounts, they don't even really can't figure it out altogether how much the U.S. is in debt.
Militarism is something that grew out of the Cold War. You see, until the end of World War II, all previous American wars were followed by demobilization and a cutback in military spending. But after World War II, they created the Soviet threat, and there was one of some magnitude. And this kept the military expenditures rising. President Eisenhower warned the country of the growing power of a military security complex. Well, after 50, 60 years, of this growing power. It's now a very powerful vested interest, and wars are necessary to its profits. And it's a very large player in the political process. It finances political campaigns, and therefore this very powerful private interest group is able to drive the militarism and drive the country into wars. You see, once the Soviet Union collapsed, the American people expected what was called a peace dividend, because we wouldn't need these enormous military expenditures as a protection against the Soviets. And so what quickly happened was the military security complex invented another threat, and it's the Muslim terrorist threat. It's Al-Qaeda. And so they have managed to go from the Soviet threat to the terrorist threat, and it maintains their power and their profits, and that's what drives the militarism.
Okay. Max Keiser, let me bring you back in here. Max Keiser, I can continue with some of these billions that the United States spends, but why don't we cut that fluff away for now and tell us what you think is going on. Either they know what they're doing or they don't. And by they, I'm talking about U.S. President Barack Obama and, well, let's bring in the two characters, Bernanke and Geithner, into the picture. But really, shed some light on this situation for us, because as it stands, and my first question to you was about the fact that there's no money left. All they're paying is interest. I mean, how are they going to be able to sustain this mode?
Well, the objective of these policies, quite clearly, is to enact a transfer of wealth. So by keeping the country perpetually in a state of war and perpetually in a state of fear, they can slip in these policies that are highly favorable to the entrenched oligarchy and the kleptocrats who are in charge of the country, and they're making fabulously amounts of money. They're becoming richer than ever before. Not even during the period of the robber barons in the United States have we seen such wealth disparity between the top 1% and the bottom, what's becoming the bottom 99%. The objective is to completely eviscerate the middle class, to steal that wealth from the middle class. And Obama is enabling this wealth transfer. And for this is his legacy. And this is really remarkable. For a man like Obama to have his story to end up in the White House and being the foot soldier in the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the United States, creating a permanent underclass with no jobs, people living on food stamps, and really on the verge of rioting in the streets. This is the Obama legacy.
And Richard Becker, you are in San Francisco, and as an American, tell us what it is that is going to push people to the top. We've seen what happened in Wisconsin. And, of course, we can refer to what has occurred in some other countries. We've seen what's happened in the Arab countries, Spain now. Of course, we're looking at the Eurozone with some of the countries that are teetering. Of course, we can mention Greece. But, of course, in the United States, it's going to be a factor, if it isn't already, in terms of the people pouring out on the streets. Tell us the consequences that you may foresee for the United States and Americans.
Well, because of the spending that's going on, both the military spending and the cutbacks, this is really posing the danger of a far deeper economic downturn than we've seen so far. The United States has all kinds of crying needs for infrastructure, for better schools, for more health care, for more teachers, for more doctors, nurses, etc. But that's not where the money is going, and much of that must come from government funding. Instead, that money is going into militarism, it's gone into huge tax cuts and so forth. And the cutbacks that are taking place in virtually every level of government, federal, state, county, municipalities, this means greater layoffs, more and more, hundreds of thousands of public workers being laid off, in addition to the millions of people who have been unable to find work. Many people I know, public workers being laid off, in addition to the millions of people who have been unable to find work. Many people I know personally who are very skilled people cannot find jobs for long periods of time, perhaps indefinitely. And we believe that this will lead inevitably, and we do not know when, but that there will be rebellion against this, as there have been in the other countries that you have mentioned.
Okay, Max Kaiser, a real-time viewer, this is what he said. You guys got it all wrong. Not this segment, but from before, based on a entry on the net, and says what really matters is how we can convince China that is in their great interest to continue the practice to ship their goods to us, meaning the U.S., in exchange for more of the same Treasury bills. Is this viewer accurate in what he's saying?
Well, it's interesting to see how China plays this currency war and coming global collapse. Remember, they've got over $3 trillion in reserves. They've got a very large position in gold. They're aggressively buying gold and silver, and they're making deals for oil all over the world peacefully in continents like Africa, and their modus operandi is to make deals with these people around the world to secure energy, and they've got the RMB, which of course can appreciate in value versus the dollar, giving their own population increased power. Are you still there?
Yes, yeah? We have you. I want to get in more on, I'm looking down this list of the billions of the spending that the United States has. Richard Becker, looking at this arms reduction treaty with Russia, $80 billion came out of that, even though it was to reduce nuclear weapons for funding. We're looking at abandoned programs and corruption in the United States, which amounts to waste. Abandoned government-sponsored programs came out to about $32 billion. Looking at the corruption survey, Iraq and Afghanistan came with billions unaccounted for. I mean, where is the accountability when it comes to things of this nature, when we're looking at where they have pushed themselves, which appears at a corner with raising the debt ceiling and then saying, well, we don't know if we're going to be able to pay the interest on it come July or August?
Well, you know, it's very interesting. If you look at the last 4 years, since the onset of the financial crisis, one conclusion we can draw from what we have seen is that while the government in the United States rules over the people, the corporations, the biggest corporations and banks, rule over the government. The government does what they tell them to do. It's amazing that there are virtually no indictments of top officials of these corporations and banks from their wild excesses of gambling, really, with the country's economy and the world economy, and violating all kinds of laws, but none of them are prosecuted. The corruption at the top is endemic, and it goes unpunished for exactly the reason I started with, is that the corporations and the banks do not answer to the government answers to them.
And Max Kaiser, in some respects, some are saying the United States is hemorrhaging. And of course, they're looking at a scenario based on some analysts that we have to look what's the United States is going to look like in a year's time. If you were to forecast it at the rate that they're going, what is it going to be like, the future for the U.S.?
Well, the trends are in place. We have some evidence this week that the Federal Reserve will go into a mode of quantitative easing part 3, which means that instead of allowing the natural forces of capitalism to right some of the excesses, they're going to try to centrally command and control this economy through the Politburo of the Federal Open Market Committee, which means that there's going to be a lot more forced injection of liquidity, which means that the price of food and energy will go much higher, and poverty rates will go much higher in America, and food stamp usage will go much higher in America. As I said at the top of the show, the only way you can rationalize what the American policymakers are doing is if you see it in the context of a suicide cult. And I'm not using this to be hyperbolic. This is, in fact, the telltale signs of a suicide cult. And this is unfortunately going to succeed. America is committing suicide. And in 2 or 3 years' time, when the U.S. dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, people will be talking about other countries. They won't be talking about America anymore.
Well, how is the crisis which the United States is in, and I assume it's a crisis, Max Kaiser, going to affect the global market, the various aspects that it might? I mean, we know that S&P is thinking of downgrading the AAA rating that the United States does have. How is that going to impact different markets around the world? And of course, the way that the United States has itself spread in those markets?
Well, the global economy is in dire straits, and the global economy is entering into a period of a massive contraction. The question is, what do we see on the other end of that contraction? And we see China with a lot of reserves, with a lot of assets, and a lot of great deals that they've done with countries all over the world. We see Brazil doing bilateral deals with Russia and Iran and China. These countries are doing deals. They're preparing themselves for this catastrophe. The U.S. is not preparing itself at all for this catastrophe. Obama and the administration has abandoned the citizens, and really, it's remarkable. He's really abandoned his own citizens. He's kind of like the captain who's left the ship. And at the other end of this crisis, the Americans will have no longer the reserve currency. They'll have no manufacturing capacity. They'll have no respect around the world. They'll be known as torturing, war profiteering leeches. And nobody will want to talk to them. They'll be the ugliest girl at the financial global ball.
And Paul Craig Roberts, at the same time, we see U.S. President Barack Obama, 4 months prior when the Arab uprising began, kind of looks like he went on a shopping spree. He gave Jordan first $150 million. Then it was up to another 600 or 700, I think, $million, close to $1 billion to Jordan. Egypt, another $1 billion. And, of course, the pledge that they've made, this $2 billion fund for North Africa and Middle Eastern countries. Maybe more to come because the Arab uprising is still continuing. So how is it that they can go out and spend money the way they are?
Well, when you have the huge deficit that they have of $1.5 trillion, a few $billion doesn't count. And the United States uses its money to purchase foreign governments. And these foreign governments don't represent their people. They represent the interest of the Americans who pay them. So that's how that happens. What is happening in the United States is that it's being run, the country is being destroyed, as Max describes it, in the interest of a very few oligarchies, powerful, rich oligarchies, the military security complex, Wall Street, for example, who control the policies, both foreign and domestic, and are using them in a short-term way that enriches them at the expense of the country. Now, when this stops, it will be when they have ruined the dollar as reserve currency. If they keep monetizing debt, they will ruin the dollar. But we don't know that that will happen because the Republicans, as I said earlier on, will use the deficit to attack the social spending programs. They will use it to try to attack Social Security and Medicare in order to continue the wars and continue the hegemony. And if the debt ceiling is not raised, there's really nothing to stop the Federal Reserve from continuing to create the money for the Treasury to spend. It's an independent agency. We already see the president being transformed into a Caesar who is above the law, independent of U.S. statutory law, of international law, as long as the country is at war. So he'll simply assert that over the debt ceiling. He'll say, I don't need Congress's approval. And the Federal Reserve will simply create the money for them to spend. So I don't think it will be the type of crisis that the financial press writes about, because once you have a Caesar, they just do things that they want to do or they think they need to do. And it becomes more and more lawless. You know, these invasions are lawless.
Okay, unfortunately, I got to jump in here. Unfortunately, we've ran out of time. We do appreciate that. Paul Craig Roberts, former Assistant Secretary to the U.S. Treasury there. Thank you. Also, like to thank financial journalist Max Keiser with his comments from Paris, and the Western Regional Coordinator of the Answer Coalition, Richard Becker. Thank you for your statements from San Francisco. Of course, the viewer for watching this edition of Press TV News Analysis. Thank you. Send us your comments at newsroom@presstv.ir. We do appreciate it. From Mikhail Batahwe and the entire team, it's goodbye.